Okay, good morning, everyone. We're here today for the closing plenary of our Youth and Farmer Consortium. We had this idea with this Action on Food Hub to bring voices that are often not been heard or that can provide solutions from on ground or inspiration to this place. And we're very excited that we had 2 amazing weeks with a lot of different activities. We had roundtables, plenaries, exchanges in the a reception room, and we want to now bring voices that maybe haven't been heard to reflect on these outcomes and to take them with us for the next weeks. So this consortium consisted of youth organizations like Youngo Food and Ag Working Group, the Empoderer Climat, Provec is International Youth Board, Global Youth Coalition, and then me, I'm Helena from IAS, the International Association of Students in Agriculture and Related Sciences. But we were very happy to also work together with the World Rural Forum to have the farmers' voice in our thing. So today we're going to reflect on the outcomes, on questions that were asked in plenaries, on roundtable discussions, and on a foresight exercise. And I'm not going to do that alone. Apparently we're still in a small room, but with not so many people. We're going to also make it interactive, so everyone will get like a red and a green card just to open and see where we maybe don't align, where we maybe had different opinions, and to have a safe space to then open the discussions after this session. So if you don't agree, we're using a red card, and if you agree, it's a green card. And if you're like, I don't have a really opinion, or both things are good and bad, you can just show them as well together. So I'm now going to invite my lovely panelists with different backgrounds, with a lot of experience. First of all, I want to welcome on the stage Alieu Badara Jallo. It's a national youth parliamentarian and a Gambian youth delegate to COP30. He followed the food and ag negotiations, and he's going to be showing how youth can be engaged in climate action, advocacy, and community development. Then I also want to welcome here Sajeev Mohan Kumar. He's a senior technical specialist at FAIR and is an ideal speaker to highlight our financial questions. I also want to welcome, so please come on stage, Vivek Venkatram. He's still a master's student in public administration fellow, but he has a lot of experience working across public and private sectors, including Air France, Bayer, Singapore Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So he has a lot of different backgrounds, and he's going to be speaking on the consumer behavior. And then lastly, our scientist Mahati Agguvari is a youth voice on food systems and soil restoration at COP30, and served as the UNCCD Youth Caucasus Steering Committee. So we're really happy to have all these people here. We're going to start with the reflections of our first panel that we did. This was called Voices of the Land. So we really wanted to bring the issues of the land, but also the steering ship, the communities, how we can bring them together. And we're going to reflect on some questions and outcomes that were happening here. What we wanted to do is bring the climate, nature, food nexus approaches in the narrative, but also highlight youth and gender roles and opportunities in these youth systems. And it showed how importance of local communities and lived experience could function. We're going to start with Mahati, as she has to leave very soon, unfortunately. A very important, so I'm going to ask you a question. One of the outcomes was the change of mindset and different production systems to ensure soil health, for example. And you work together with the CASH Coalition Alliance for Soil Health. And your question is, a very important mention that we caught for the first plenary is that its central mindset around farming professions needs to be changed. Young farmers especially need to see the farming profession can provide a dignified and good lives. But how can we really change this mindset? How can we make this shift to have a different production system?
Can you hear me? Yeah, all right. Thanks, Helena. So I'm sorry I'll have to leave a little earlier, but I'll quickly get to the question. So talking about how we change the mindset of youth to want to get into agriculture, I think I would like to start with a small statistic that in India, the average age of the farmer is 53 years. none of the youth want to continue in the farming occupation, and also their parents don't want them to continue in the occupation, and that's largely because of the kind of livelihoods they have. It's highly risky. They're prone to a lot of deaths, stuck in the death cycle. So when we actually look into the actual why is this happening? Why are they stuck in death cycles, right? And a big part of is the cost of doing agriculture has gone up a lot. The cost of inputs has risen by 5-6 times in the last 20 years, but the income has maybe gone up by just 30%. So there's a really wide gap between the cost of inputs and what they're earning. And the cost of inputs going up because they're largely dependent on chemical inputs, which are expensive. They have to depend on external inputs, not something they can, produce on their field. So moving towards a regenerative agriculture system, and that's something that we've proven. I work with Save Soil. We work with over 250,000 farmers. And we've seen that when they use inputs that can be prepared within the farm, when they sort of work towards soil health, it takes some time, but the cost of inputs goes down largely. Their income increases, productivity increases. So, and we've also seen that over time, these farmers who we work with, their children are coming back to the farms. So I think showing that agriculture can be profitable, changing the mindset about what kind of lives farmers have, that has to be shown through evidence. It can't just be told, youth want to have a good life. Of course, you all want to have a good income, a good lifestyle. We can't take that away from people. But showing that farmers too can have something of that sort is very important. So one crucial thing to be done is probably pick case studies from around the world where different newer forms of agriculture have led to increase in farmers' incomes, better lifestyles, and sort of show agriculture in different light is something that's very crucial for people like you and me and other youths to even consider that as an occupation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So we had this interactive ID, so feel free to also, I saw a lot of nodding in the panel, so that's nice. The idea what we had is during all these negotiations, we have always this poker face, we can't really react, but here we can. You can nod, it's totally fine, but feel free to also use these cards. And I think a lot of things were addressed here on how this current system maybe not yet is so interactive for youth, but if we can show that it is sustainable and if we can show that we can protect the biodiversity and you have an income of it, it actually is a nice way of living and protecting the nature, so combining these things. We also had another challenge, and that is we're here at COP, we're talking about policy negotiations. But we still see that there is a very big disconnection between what's happening on the ground and what's been discussed in the room. Although there are some connections created by actors, I want to know from Alieu, our youth negotiator here, how can governments and policy experts connect more with the work that has been done on the ground and connect with this lived experience that we had in our first plenary that was called Voices of the Land?
Yeah, I think now it's working. All right. Okay, thank you so much for that brilliant question. I'm Aliou Badara Diallo, a youth parliamentarian from the Gambia. So I think the very first stage of every policy formulation is problem identification, which includes where this is the stage where you involve beneficiaries, where they will come up and air out the challenges or issues that they are facing. Even though the governments are doing it, but it needs to be strengthening in order to deeply cover the challenges that farmers are facing, or youth, or whatever stakeholder we are discussing. But from our perspective, the Gambia, we have our NDC streamline the works on the ground, especially on agriculture. We have flagship projects like the Roots Giraffe that aims to empower farmers. But you can see that that project does not cover all the farmers. It only covers 30% of the farmers in the Gambia, leaving 70% of the farmers, struggling still now. Which is why it is very important that even policies to be co-created by farmers and policymakers. You can see that is the only way that policies can really solve the problems that farmers are facing or real life experience. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's really great. And then if we look at these negotiations that we followed, like I know you also were engaged in the Sharm el-Sheikh. Thank you, Mahati, for joining us. You were also involved with the Sharm el-Sheikh joint work on the implementation of climate action in agriculture and food security. And you talk about these NDCs, but how, and that not all the farmers are included. How do you think these negotiations could also lead to more collaboration and more ambitions in NDCs focusing on agriculture?
Okay, so far, even though this is my first time attending COP and the negotiations is a learning point for me, but what I observe is that still now things are still lagging. Like you can see negotiations are still going on there and they have not reached even any consensus for right now. But I believe, I don't know if miracles may happen in these last days, but still now, like, I don't see any decision that has been made or negotiation that is going for so far so good. Yeah.
Yes, so maybe not that much ambition yet in the room, and we need to bring that with our youth. What Mahati also said, like we need to make sure that we have profit due to that our lands are productive, and that we can really gain a value out of agriculture. But there is also still a lot of finance gaps between climate action that needs to go to agriculture. And we have Sajeev here from FAIR. What we want to know to you is that there's maybe the limit is not only the quantity of finance, but also the access. Could you please share with us which way we could make finance more accessible? Definitely for here, the farmer and youth co-hosts. How can we have these ways towards a more performance-based finance?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think we are almost towards the end of COP, and I think we're all running on fumes. But I think there is still, it's good to see so much energy and passion for food systems in this COP, which I think is great. And it started at COP 28, and now I'm seeing a lot of the momentum running into these COPs as well. My name is Sajeev. I work for the FAIR Initiative, and we are an investor network. We work with over 400 investor members across the globe who have $90 trillion of assets under management. So it's quite a big network. And our vision is that we want to change the agri-food system transformation using the investor influence. So obviously there's a lot of levers that one can use in terms of changing and transforming the food system. Policy is a definitely important one. But we feel like an advocacy as well, right? I think that's important as well. But we feel like, we talk about morality a lot and doing the right stuff, but we communicate with investors in terms of materiality and financial materiality. So like Mahati said, I think it has to make economic sense. There has to be a return on investment. There has to be a scalability aspect when we're talking about transformational solutions. And I think one thing that was really good at this COP is that I heard a lot of conversations around the 3 Rio conventions, looking at linking up the climate, biodiversity, and the land use elements. And given that we have 3 COPs next year, I think it's really good to see that. But the most important point is that everybody name-checked agri-food systems as the key connector between these 3 Rio conventions. And that's good to see, which also gives us a lot of responsibility in terms of tackling this issue. In terms of the investment and the financial side, obviously, we have estimates showing that very little climate finance goes towards agriculture anyways. And the problem is that even within that little finance, a lot of it goes towards improving efficiency of intensive production practices. So if we are tying up the 3 Rio conventions and we have to meet climate and biodiversity goals, even the little finance that's going, we need to be able to reallocate it. Of course, we're asking for more finance, right? So, and I'll give you an example of the study that we did. There's a lot of conversations around regenerative agriculture. So what we did was we looked at all of the corporate commitments on regenerative agriculture. We looked at 79 companies. 50 of them explicitly mentioned regenerative agriculture as a strategy to have climate and nature goals. But only 4 out of those 50 companies had financial incentives to support farmers. I mean, that is bizarre. If you have, as a company, have commitments for regenerative agriculture and you don't support farmers, that transformation is not going to happen. So what we are trying to do is to educate our investor members in terms of showing them the gaps in these solutions and encouraging them to talk to the companies to reallocate capital and mobilize more action in the space. I'll say one more thing on the policy side, because we always talk about private capital. We say that, the private capital has to come in and fill the gap. But then you have these harmful subsidies, which is going in the opposite direction. So you are creating this push and pull sort of situation where private capital has to go above and beyond some of the national policies. And you talked about NDCs. I would also highlight we need to talk about NBSAPs as well. Can we link NDCs and NBSAPs together? Am I taking your points?
I put agreed.
Okay. Are you, okay, great. So I think that's also like something that's required. But also I want to end on something, because we always talk about solutions silos. We talk about regenerative agriculture so on to solve the problem. We talk about food loss and food waste. We talk about protein diversification or plant-based diets. I think we need all of it to work together, because one solution is not going to be able to solve the problem. And this is something that we want to see, and that's something that we're educating our investor members. We have a huge base, and we want to work with corporates to change how they invest in this space, and also investors sort of investing in the solution side of things. There's little climate finance going into this at the moment, but what we want to showcase is that agriculture is always seen as a risk, but we also want to showcase the opportunities that exist within the space to encourage investments, and we want to spread that positive message in terms of encouraging capital flowing towards this.
Yes, and lovely to see that it had a positive reaction here as well. Here at the Scopy also, I'm here also at a pavilion that really values also the food system. And you said it like our solutions maybe are in silos, and then our finance is also in silos. But we need to connect the current pressures and the current incentives that drive farmers, and then comes back to Mahati's point that if we want to have this sustainable, we need to have a fair income. But therefore, there's also a role for consumers. And then I want to ask to you, Vivek, how can we educate consumers to make sustainable food choices that are depending on where they live, of course, and how can we make sure that this is connected to the environment and leads back to fair incentives to the producers?
No, definitely. And I'm also wary of kind of echoing a lot of the points that we've already heard, but I think it's a positive thing that we're all talking about similar barriers and also coming up with solutions that are broadly in the same direction, because it means that we're getting something right? I think we have that scientific consensus, and now we have the alignment, like we heard from Mahati on incentives, and then Sajeev also on bridging those incentives. And then I appreciate Aliu's contribution on how the negotiations, while they have positively highlighted food systems, are lacking concrete mentions of it. Like we didn't see any mention in the Muchira text, just transition, a passing mention on climate resilience. And then also the SSJW being postponed now to Bonn, which is fun for all of us. But on your point, Helena, I just want to make 3 observations on what the blockers are here. And I'll try to make it brief, but I think it's important to contextualize that. One, we need to align on the scientific consensus on what is and is not a driver of a more sustainable and just food system. And what I mean to say here is not that there's one magic pill or silver bullet, not at all. That we don't have to agree on everything, but we at least need to agree on what is absolutely, greenwashing, so that we engage in this decentralized transition, but not in a way that, shoots us in the foot. And the second point, broad observation, is that once we have that credible scientific consensus agreed within our community, and we have our own solutions while we're working in our own silos, we need to tackle the barriers at play that prevent credible information flows. And the third is we need to understand when it comes to consumers, that consumers are not necessarily making these decisions on the basis of climate, right? There's so much more at play, and we need to get out of our high horse or our ivory tower and understand that consumers are really looking at financial viability, right? Comes down to that, comes down to the taste, price, convenience, trifecta. So if I could, on the first point, on aligning on scientific consensus, right? I think we've already touched upon the different areas. I'll talk about my vertical in plant-rich food systems. So I believe we need to take a common but differentiated responsibility in the promotion of this. We know the food security point that 83%, majority of our calories the majority of our farmland is used for only 18% a minority of our calories when it comes to industrial animal ag. And then we know the point about the inefficiencies, right? 25 to 1 ratio from the Yale Center for Business Studies and Environment for cows, 15 to 1 for pork, and 9 to 1 for chicken. And lastly, on the greenhouse gas point, if we shift to a plant-based food system, that's a 49% reduction, and this is according to the largest meta-analysis on this issue. But this is not the only point, right? There's also food waste. The 2024 Food Waste Index shared that if food waste were a country, it would be the third largest emitter after the US and China. This is a very important point that is often neglected, and we need to keep in mind that 733 million people as of last year are suffering from acute hunger and malnutrition. So we need solutions to go into this space, right? Look into the blockers on food waste. Third is on the point about agroecology, right? That Mahati brought up. We need inclusive agroecology. We need to harness it based on regenerative agriculture and honor indigenous knowledge systems that have existed for thousands of years and have the solutions out there, but simply lack the ability to translate those solutions into these multilateral bodies. So I think that's like a broader picture on the first point on where we need to go. We know what the solutions are. They're all scientifically backed. We shouldn't be infighting. We should be promoting each other, encouraging the positive mindset instead of the doom and gloom. And then when it comes to the second point on the barriers, right? So last year I was speaking with a professor who was involved in writing this book on merchants of doubt, right? And this is the playbook that the tobacco industry used in the 60s and 70s. Where, let me just read out from a memo by R.J. Reynolds, famous tobacco company, but I don't think they're really as prominent now, for good reasons. They said that doubt is our product, and we need to market doubt and uncertainty of the scientific consensus here. And therefore, we'll confuse the body of fact about the health risks of tobacco. And what we're seeing here in food systems on the second point is that the same thing is being done by Big Ag. We had the Changing Markets report. I don't know if y'all are familiar with the report. It, very briefly summarizing, it kind of found that with the Eat Lancet in 2018, 50% of the online misinformation on Twitter was from a select group of misinfluencers. And about 90% of the online engagement here was from this group of misinfluencers, industry-friendly scientists, doctors, health influencers, journalists. And I think this also makes sense when it comes to the 2018 MIT study, which showed that lies and falsehoods spread 8 times faster than the truth on social media. So the way in which the solution here is that we should speak out against the merchants of these doubt, right? We had the DSMOG analysis. There are 300 big ag lobbyists here at the COP. When it comes to biodiversity, 80% of the deforestation in the Amazon is due to cattle ranching, right? We know what the incentives are here. We need to call it out very directly. And I think we need to do that as a coalition, right? We have the coalition of what the solutions are, then we have the coalition about what the information is. And very briefly, I know I probably ran a bit over time, but on the solution for credible information flows and aligning that with consumer purchases, we know the trifecta of taste, price, and convenience over climate information. But we also need to look at where the opportunities are and direct our energies towards there. Let's take the tropical forest forever facility, right? 5.5 billion has been allocated to go and protect this forest facility, and food systems is inextricably linked to all of this and the three Rio conventions. So we need to position ourselves strategically so that we take advantage of these funds, and then we push our solutions together, and hopefully, bring the consumers along by understanding exactly what they need.
Very interesting. I first thought my card system would not be very interactive, but I want to give you the opportunity to actually react, because it was on the system and finance, and then definitely the 3 Rio conventions where you also mentioned. So very briefly, because we're already a little bit over time.
I just want to play devil's advocate here. So I'm not. No, I think like there's one thing around calling big ag out, which I think like there is it's one of the levers that you could use to sort of change the system. But I also think there is value in engaging with them. So I think that's what we try to do. So for instance, we work with a lot of Brazilian meat producers, who are driving a lot of deforestation in this space. But our theory of change is that, if we want to get to that North Star, I think we also need to bring them on the journey. which means that we acknowledge and we make them realize that there is deforestation, which is a supply chain risk for them. So communicating in that sense, where you sort of say, like, if you have the long-term sustenance of your business at heart, you need to like address this issue, educate investors about this issue, rather than like maybe naming and shaming them, which we also do at times when things get quite drastic. But at the same time, I think there is also value that we've seen in working with them. And again, I think peer examples in terms of looking at some of the companies that operate in the space who are doing the right things and bringing them to the table and having an honest, candid exchange with them in terms of what is possible. I mean, these conversations really move the system forward. Otherwise, and again, we sometimes end up creating silos. So I think, again, then we talking to a brick wall and there's no engagement. So I think that is a tool that should also be used alongside the other tools. And I was just trying to stir up the conversation a little bit.
Amazing, thank you. And this also brings us to our next, maybe if there is time in the end, we can go in. Because we also had a lot of other things. We're supposed to have 2 roundtables, one with youth, engaging with negotiators, and looking forward, like, what will happen after COP31? Where will the Sharm el-Sheikh joint work negotiations go to, and how can we make sure that they are more inclusive, effective, and efficient? So we identified some problems and went for some solutions, but we're still processing these results, and they're yet not able to analyze. But it's a very interesting, because there were a lot of things where parties agreed on, that this process now has a little bit been disappointing to really achieve the climate action that we all need. So we're looking very forward also in Bonn in coming up with some more concrete solutions for this. However, we can also look a little bit further than COP31, and therefore we had a foresight exercise here in the reception hall that really looked at how can we achieve these sustainable goals in our agri-food system, and therefore I'm very excited to announce a sort of keynote speaker here on stage, Finley Wilson, who is a climate and development specialist and expertise in adaptation, climate finance and agriculture, and he is here with the Global Youth Global Youth Coalition, and he's going to give us the reflections of these foresight exercise and what we can take away from this. And then I'll invite the panel to give like a very short reaction on this, and afterwards I will also invite the public to give a reaction on all these things, a question, interact with the cards. Okay, Finley?
Thank you, Helena. I appreciate that. Thanks for the invitation to be in probably what is the warmest room in the world. I hope everyone's having a nicer time than I am. But yeah, I'm here to talk about a foresight workshop that GYC, Global Youth Coalition, took forward last Friday on the 14th. And I think this is a really valuable opportunity to get a little bit more creative than a lot of the discussions that take place in COP. Because I think we'd all agree that in many ways, we have many of the technical fixes that we need to solve the climate crisis. At this stage, what we really lack is political will and convincing stories for more utopian, more resilient, more optimistic futures. And I think this workshop really gets at the heart of that. Vivek, you mentioned doom and gloom. I think that is a symptom that happens when we lack this kind of approach. So hopefully by the end of this sort of mini segment, you'll understand where I'm coming from, and hopefully, maybe it'll be something that we've all learned and can take forward a little bit more in our work. But yeah, so this workshop consisted of 3 segments: the Free Horizons framework, backcasting, and future wheels. And just as a side note, I really appreciate and enjoy this kind of methodology because I'm an advocate for an equitable and just transition, and I feel like this really helps us to not just imagine a better future, but also plot out milestones and actually proactive steps for how we can get there one day. So I hope you all enjoy this as much as I enjoyed reading about it. But yeah, so normally with the Free Horizons structure, you've got 3 horizons. One is the world today, one is the world in the future, and then the second horizon is how we get there. A lot of the time when we're thinking about the future, we ground it unintentionally in the world today, the limitations, be those financial, environmental, economical, so many. To mix this up, this Horizons framework goes the other way around, where free of all the problems in today's world, you instead try to visualize what your best case scenario future could look like, should look like. You can all try and do that now because we're going to have a bit of an interactive section at the end. And then go back to the present day and contrast that to what we actually have now. And then with the second horizon, try and figure out actually how do we achieve a transition from our ideal future to today, vice versa. So in this workshop, the future that the participants wanted, it might not surprise anyone here, but it focused on smallholder farmers who not just exploit and try to extract value from nature, but actually work with nature, understand nature, protect nature, and have more of a regenerative role rather than a extractive role. Biodiversity, of course, being very important as well. On the people-led side, shifts broadly throughout society towards plant-based, seasonal diets, but also on a supply chain perspective, shorter supply chains, they're a lot more transparent, a lot closer to home. The present system, however, unlike this regenerative system, is more characterized by industrialization, extractivism. I mean, we all know it, we all live it every day, so I don't need to dwell on that. But also from the farmer's perspective, long debt cycles, long opaque supply chains, and from a consumer perspective, oftentimes with ultra-processed foods, completely opaque ideas of what the food actually is in the first place, let alone how we got it. So, when you do this exercise, you imagine a kind of utopian, or at least better, depending on how creative and imaginative you are, future, and then you imagine the world today. Section 2, which is all about backcasting, sort of plots out milestones for how we get there, how we achieve it. So it can be in different chunks of time, but it typically is over chunks of time, so 5-10 years. And what the participants of this workshop did is they agreed with kind of current day, the changes they'd like to see, in 2035, the changes they'd like to see, and how that changes by 2050, which is kind of set as a theoretical endpoint. When all these changes get done, everything's fantastic. So today, if everything started moving right now, participants would focus on softer cultural shifts, so advocacy, focusing on fresh, healthy, plant-based and sustainable food, but also transport came up more than you might expect, cycling rather than driving, more transparency, not just in terms of the ingredients within food, but the environmental impact and the long-term sustainability of food, and then also restructuring cities, food systems overall, integrating food systems into high-level climate strategies. Fast forwarding to 2035, you see a more solid drive for harder interventions, government-led interventions, so taxes on meat and dairy, mandating environmental impact labels, physically restructuring cities to promote cycling over driving, land redistribution, etc. And then by 2050, you have a more formalized regenerative state where rather than large agro-industrial farming businesses, you instead have smallholders being as the norm, working in partnerships amongst each other, but also with local nature, environmental protection agencies. So again, create this regenerative system that doesn't exploit, but instead serves to be, yes, a food-producing system, but also a resilient, regenerative one that doesn't just take into account people's stomachs, but also the needs of the planet and the need of the people more holistically. So now we have a vision for a future, milestones on how to achieve it, but there are obviously many, many difficult policy steps that you need to get there. And this is where the final part of this process takes place, where, sorry, my notes are all out of order now. There we go. So this is Futures Wheels, where essentially you think about the ripple effects, the positive ripple effects, but also the negative ripple effects of specific interventions. And I suppose this is where we can open the floor up a little bit to you three and figure out whether these ideas sound like positives, whether they sound like negatives, maybe there's some disagreement. There's some I agree with more than others, I'll say that much. But the main three to pick out here, and the most contentious one to start with, would be around land use. So one participant proposed a transformative policy of mandating that land unused for 10 years must be rented to the government for food production. And that's just a blanket policy that in this, future that this person has come up with, that's what they'd follow. And the idea behind that, or the consequences of it, are quite polarizing. On one hand, it promises shorter supply chains, of course, easier access to affordable, healthy and sustainable food, as well as greener urban environments, reducing urban heat islands, and supporting the physical and mental well-being of citizens. However, on the other hand, people also predicted immediate and severe social friction, anger regarding inheritance and private property rights, because of course land ownership is very key to this conversation, alongside doubts about who would actually farm this land. So you can think about that one once I finish the other two on this list. Maybe we can open it back up. Second, more about economic trade-offs. A participant was really keen on the idea of only exporting surplus food. So in this scenario, the outcomes of that would be an initial drop in GDP, or at least that's what people agreed, over maybe the first 1 to 5 years, whilst the system adjusts initially. But then, to weather the transition, farmers would also require additional money, capacity building efforts, so it would require a lot of cooperation, perhaps from the state or the private sector, to preempt this shift and also to maximize the impacts of it. And one of the impacts would be that farmers have more control over what they grow, more crop diversification, better soil health, development of local seed banks, etc. However, some of the participants also thought that there were the absence of raw commodities exported would also spur the creation of new manufacturing sectors, which would then in turn transform locally grown food into processed products. Finally, more focused on consumer responsibility, mandating impact labeling and financial incentives promoting carbon-friendly foods. I think we'd all broadly know what that would look like. In terms of positive consequences, however, the participants explored the possibility of lower meat consumption and, of course, the emissions associated with that, lower carbon consumption, but also unintended negative consequences, say extremely strict labeling guidelines, kind of opens the door in some cases to greenwashing or other forms of something similar. Impact labels going hand in hand with financial incentives, as well as reducing taxes for plant-based food was seen as a direct route to make production cheaper and increasing access to healthy food for more people. So with that, I suppose maybe Helena, you come back, then I go back there, and we could discuss this some more.
I think a lot of things were addressed. Now you have to see how many we can actually address. So I would invite the panelists to only take maybe 1, max 2 points that were addressed here to give a very brief, short reflection on that. Is there anyone who wants to open with a topic? You guys were discussing. You want to take the same topic?
No, we just wanted to hear what the second point was. Surplus exports. Okay. So exporting only the surplus. Yeah. No, I think these are great blue sky ideas. I mean, but it's great. I was moderating another panel where you had Roy Steiner from Rockefeller Foundation, and he said that when we are asked to think about the future, we always think about the worst, and this is reflected in all the movies that we see, right? Like whatever, Apocalypse and all that stuff. So I think it's really positive that you're kind of flipping the script on that and asking them to think about a future that you want to see rather than the doom and gloom, which is great. I think some of the ideas are great, but then, it's very blue sky, right? I think there's no practical limitations and logistics and so on. And I think one thing I wanted to highlight is that the agri-food system is very complex. So I think if we want to have an equitable, nutritious, healthy food system for all, tying it to some sort of a global view might not be the best way to tackle it, because there are a lot of regions which are the bread baskets of the world or produce a lot of protein and so on. Other regions probably might not be able to. So I think we have to take everybody along. And again, I think in terms of some of the impacts of what you feel from the food production system for climate, nature, climate especially, it's not uniformly felt across the world. So there are people that we might have to bring out much faster than others. Again, this onus on consumer expectation, I feel like it's a bit far-fetched because giving consumers so much information and asking them to make the right choices. Of course, there might be a select few consumers who might do that. I would rather tackle it from the point of view of working with retailers and so on, and really letting them spend their R&D and marketing money and so on to signal consumers in the right direction. And usually now retailers don't take the responsibility. They just blame it on consumers not making the right choices. But they are market makers essentially, and they can really signal that intent to consumers. And I think policy is one. I was surprised we didn't hear anything about policy. I mean, there is a lot of money already going towards unsustainable food practices. I mean, if we are able to align that with the right taxonomies in terms of defining what good looks like and what are the practices we should prioritize, and channel the public money in that direction, it de-risks a lot of the investment that can come from the private capital. So this is something, these are the mechanisms I think that we can use to sort of, accelerate the transformation. But I like the idea of that sort of 2050 situation, right? But we need to start putting those changes now, because right now what we're doing is we are creating lock-ins. And once we create those lock-ins, it's very difficult to break them. Mm-hmm. So I think, it's sort of the slow change that sort of builds up in the right direction.
Okay, maybe Elio, which things have been resembled you, or like what did you think was outstanding in his?
Yeah. Yeah. So I want to come in like your first point. You made mention of land that are unused should be rented to the government. That are unused for 10 years should be rented to the government, right? Am I correct? Yeah. Should be rented. Rented. Yeah. So I think that is an ideal idea, but coming from the Gambia or Africa in large, this really needs to invest in community trust because it's not exactly the same scenario, but we have similar. There are kind of similar scenario in the Gambia where the government plans to clear the road because there are shops that come very close to the road, and they plans to demolish all those shops that are beside the roads. So that is a transition that requires even community trust or awareness for them to know the importance of what the government is doing. You understand? But the government did not do that. Like they did not reach out to the communities or to tell them why they are even demolishing the shops that are beside the roads because how to call it, the Gambians don't know that. Yeah. So when the government started demolishing the shops, this brings social tension in the Gambia, where you have families even crying because these are the source of income. This is the place where they have the source of income for their families. You will see women crying because they don't know the importance of what the government is doing. So it is very important that to reach out to the communities, to tell them the importance of why you are bringing this policy, and I think that is the best way to do it.
And I think that's an amazing attribution to the notes that were made, or the suggestion that was made. Vivek, there was also something on consumer behavior, or maybe you had another point you wanted to do a reflection on?
Hi, testing. Yeah, it works. Okay. Yeah, I completely agree with you, Aliyu, and I this echoes what I heard on the first point. Like for the first point, echoes a conversation I had with someone from the Ministry of Agriculture in Nigeria, where they're talking about in the Katsina state, there's a lot of conflict between herders and other kinds of farmers. And I think if the government doesn't know what's happening on the ground, just taking these unilateral decisions is just not the way forward. We need to bring people along, and I think that's true for the first point. Also true for the second point on only exporting the surplus, right? Because as Sajeev pointed out, it's not like a homogeneous food system where every single product is bioavailable in every single place. And I think we need to also realize that there are efficiencies with exporting food that we wouldn't achieve otherwise. Like, let's say if I was trying to grow bananas in a greenhouse in Norway, right? That just wouldn't make sense. So I think we have to keep that point in mind. And then lastly, very quickly touching up on the labeling, which is like I think why I'm here, right? Is that I agree that labeling is important, and I like how optimistic this plan is, but I think we need to be a bit more realistic with what is actually driving consumers, and we need to understand that at some point you can do only so much with the consumer, right? You have to go to the tap, the source of the tap, and control where the water flows. And where I think we need to work on is stuff like what Denmark has done with the Global North, encouraging the Plant-Based Action Plan, and seeing how we can expand that across other areas. And we need to take like a phasal approach here. Start with the Global North, start where food security is not as much of a problem, where you are able to shift your overconsumption of whatever kinds of proteins into more sustainable options. And I think there are multiple, as you mentioned, Sadeep, that there's multiple, like the funding that's going to unsustainable practices is multifold. And if we can redirect some of that, that's where we should focus on, rather than focusing too much on consumers, which some people are doing, and I appreciate that, but this is just my opinion.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, of course. Feel free to sit there, yeah.
I think the common thread between what you three were saying is maybe a necessary part of the fact that this was done at COP. So obviously you've got perspectives from global participants. And I think a lot of the issues with agriculture, a lot of the issues around agriculture that we've seen in this pavilion over the last 2 weeks focus on the difficulties of adaptation, of resilience. And of course, for resilience and adaptation to be effective, it needs to be locally led. It needs to be responsive to the needs of local people, local biomes, etc. And so having a global perspective where everyone's pulling into this collective vision of the future, of course, is not necessarily going to work everywhere. I think you were mentioning how, you've got breadbasket regions. This policy might work for them, but for other areas, especially areas more heavily impacted by climate change, who will see sharper reductions in their agricultural productivity, it might not work there. But I think what I'd really like to see is this approach carried out more at local levels, seeing the local stories that people come up with, the local directions they'd like their local communities to go in, and then they could start to tell more compelling stories. Because I feel like one of the most compelling aspects of this COP has been the civil society and indigenous voices, which have been so present and so visible. And finally, they have an ability to tell their very locally led story, but on a global platform. This kind of workshop, this kind of approach can be used for the exact same reasons in the exact same way, hopefully to the exact same effect. So that's what I would really like to see next. I completely agree with each of your points. I think sometimes when you take it to too high a level, it might seem overly naive or not really workable, but I think it's a really good starting point, and it can get you to start thinking more creatively and proactively about what could come next and what should come next, rather than feeling, as you said, Vivek, the doom and gloom first, which can, I think, stifle the creativity to think about a just transition. So, yeah.
Although I think we're getting to the most interesting part of this discussion, like the real dialogue between this and the reactions. The audience seems to have been a little bit thinner now for questions, but if there is anyone here that wants to submit a question, please do. Otherwise, I think Vivek and Sajeev still had an ongoing issue on the agribusiness that they have 1 minute each for.
Sorry. Yeah, so just recapping for anybody who forgot, basically my kind of suggestion was that we directly call a spade and call out, the 300 big ag lobbyists here at COP, for example, who are taking the space away from indigenous voices, from youth groups, from other marginalized groups. And Sajeev's point, if I'm paraphrasing correctly, is that we need to work with these powers because they're the ones who have the ability to make that change. And I agree with that, the premise, right? That these are the folks who have the weight, right? Since they're the consolidated groups here, they have the most power to shift the way that things are done. Even a 1% shift at a massive scale could be significant, more than anything that probably any individual could do. But I think what I'd like to bring across is that maybe it's not so much a mutually exclusive thing. And I think to the Rabin doctrine brought up by President Juan Santos, who won the Nobel Peace Prize due to his work in negotiating with the FARC, right? And what I recall from a conversation I had with him was that he said that in his approach, obviously these are not terrorists, right? I just want to preface that. In his approach, he both negotiated with the terrorists, but also had his fighters, his paramilitary fighters, to go and nip the problem at the bud. And then while he was fighting the terrorists, he both negotiated inside those rooms, and that actually gave him more leverage to make a peace agreement with the FARC and kind of weaken their influence over time. So I think a similar approach can be taken here, where we have our groups who are working with them, right? But also we have the groups, maybe the youth, the more activist type, to call them out in the ways that we can, and hope that in doing so, we're not shutting off the dialogue, but we're at least ensuring that the dialogue is science-backed, and they know that, you're kind of cornered over here. And in terms of game theory, right, like the off path that you have is you have to work with us. There's no other way of trying to flip the narrative or greenwash the entire space. But Sajeev, why don't you respond?
Yeah, and I think this was the first dialogue already, opening.
No, I think I agree. I think what I was trying to say was that there are different levers of change, right? And I think advocacy, activism is definitely one of them. I think that actually when you put them in that spot, I think then they look for options or opportunities to diversify and change how they operate. I think, but it should not be that we create more silos with those conversations, right? Where one group shuts off, and especially now, given the power of the big ag, I mean, they do control, like you said, the conversations and the narrative. I think what we are trying to do is, can we sort of change the narrative a bit based on some of the findings from the Changing Markets Institute and the Mighty Earths and so on, but then use that information to be able to communicate that back to the companies, but maybe from a different narrative. So we talk a lot about regenerative agriculture. What we do as an organization is that we look at their commitments and we hold them accountable in terms of, are you really delivering this practice or are you really greenwashing? But at the same time, we really want to support them in terms of showing them positive examples of what other companies have done where they have generated economic benefits. So that is the sort of the carrot, let's say, right, instead of the stick approach that we want to adopt. Yeah, so I think we do hold them accountable at the same time, but we want to engage and build that relationship with them so we can help them change. And then we push from the investor side as well, where we say, like, we educate investors about the supply chain resilience aspect, portfolio resilience of their investments, and say that you would face extreme losses if we operate in this way, which means that you have to be engaging with these companies. And this is like 3 to 5 year engagements. So it's not that we tomorrow go in and say, like, diversify all of your meat production. But if we say a transition plan where they're going towards plant-based products, I think that's a big win for us. So again, I think it's sort of like working within the system, but at the same time, the work that's done by other organizations in terms of putting pressure, the work done by policy in terms of creating those enabling environments, everything also helps us in having those relationships and engaging with them.
I'm also interested to have Alir's ideas on this aspect. Like, what do you think about this discussion? Mm-hmm.
How to call it? With regards to what exactly?
On the, like, how do we include agro-businesses that are here that maybe lobby or maybe like have some consolidated power, but if we include it or if we have different systems on how to work together with them, we can actually provide faster solutions or have them on board. So should we be on Vivek, that's like, let's be a little bit more activist, call them out and really like try to push from them to change? Or should we be like really like sitting with them together, showcasing what are our solutions, and then they both agree now that we should do both and that we can have attributes in them. But maybe what is your view on like their presence here?
So I think seeing is believing. Like, when you show people what you are into, and if it is good and they appreciate it or they subscribe to it, I think that is the best way you can do it. But you cannot use force or how to call it. You be boss on people, be strong on people, like showing your activist skills or whatsoever to kind of convince them on certain things. I think dialogue is very important, and that is the best way you can convince people.
Amazing. Okay, and with that, this is the end of the plenary. Sorry, Finley, if you also had like an interesting idea on this, but we can talk this in the reception and maybe continue the foresight exercise of what we do with this youth and farmer co-host and how can we make it implementing climate action and go on. So I want to say a big thank you to my panelists that prepared this, that didn't attend the sessions, but still are very interested in what we did with this consortium. So thank you so much. Okay, shall we take one group picture? And then also, please return the cards. We're not going to waste them.